Eleanor Voss was 31 years old on the morning her brother took everything. She stood in the solicitor's office in her mourning dress, the elbows repaired twice over, the hem let down once, and listened while Mr. Gareth Hale read aloud from the page her father had signed 3 years before his death. The farm went to Martin, the house went to Martin. The livestock, the equipment, the autumn harvest still standing in the field. All of it went to Martin. Eleanor received a parcel of land on the northern slope of Cairn Hill, 42 acres of exposed rock and bracken, with a collapsed shepherd's hut and no road to speak of. Martin did not look at her when the page was turned. He straightened his cuffs and nodded at the solicitor as though the matter were already settled. And perhaps it was. But in Eleanor's coat pocket, beneath a folded handkerchief and 3 copper coins, was a piece of paper her father had pressed into her hand on the last morning she had sat beside him, a paper she had not yet fully understood, and which no one else in that room had thought to ask about. The Voss family had farmed the same valley in the North Riding of Yorkshire for 3 generations. Eleanor's grandfather had cleared the first field. Her father, Thomas Voss, had expanded it steadily, adding pasture, mending walls, negotiating boundary agreements with neighboring landowners in the years when the railways were beginning to push their way into the hills, and every acre of land carried a new kind of significance. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one. He kept meticulous records, and from the time Eleanor was 14, sitting beside him at the kitchen table with a candle between them and the farm ledger open before her, she had learned to keep records too. She had a particular gift for it. Not merely for the arithmetic, though she was quick and accurate, but for the kind of patient reading that ledger work required, spotting a discrepancy, following a line of figures across several pages until an error surfaced, understanding what one number meant in relation to another number 3 columns away. Her father had also taught her to read the land survey maps that accompanied the farm's boundary documents, the county records held at the registry office in North Allerton, the hand-drawn plans that solicitors produced when land changed hands or a boundary was disputed. When Eleanor was 23, she had helped her father resolve a disagreement with the Aldred family to the east, matching the old plan against the current hedgerow measurements until the error was found. A mistranscription carried forward, unchallenged for 40 years. The solicitor who reviewed her work said nothing complimentary. He did, however, accept the figures. Her brother Martin was 5 years older. He had worked alongside their father through the last decade, but his temperament suited the management of men rather than the management of records. He supervised, he decided, he bargained at market. He had no patience for paperwork and considered Eleanor's facility with accounts a domestic convenience, no different in kind from her ability to salt pork or keep the linen in order. When their father's health began to fail in the winter of 1857, Martin assumed full charge of the farm's daily operation. Eleanor continued with the ledgers. No one had discussed what would happen when Thomas Voss died. Eleanor had assumed, because she had no particular reason to assume otherwise, that the farm would provide for them both in some practical arrangement. Thomas died in March of 1858. He was 64 years old and had been failing since Christmas. Eleanor sat with him through the last 3 nights. On the final morning, when his breathing had grown shallow and the room was cold despite the banked fire, he reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pressed a folded paper into her hands. He did not explain it. He said, quietly and with some effort, "The north slope, keep that." Then he closed his eyes, and by afternoon he was gone. Eleanor unfolded the paper that evening in her room. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but deliberate, unmistakably her father's work. It showed Cairn Hill from above, the farm boundary running along the southern and western edges, The northern slope was cross-hatched in a way she did not immediately recognize. Beneath the cross-hatching, in her father's hand in ink faded to warm brown, were the words, "North Slope, do not sell." And below that, in smaller letters, Survey 1841, registered. She tucked it into her coat pocket. She wore that coat to the solicitor's office. When Mr. Hale finished reading the will, Eleanor understood that her father's careful arrangements had not included her in the way she had imagined. There was nothing hostile in the document itself. Thomas Voss had simply divided his estate as a farmer of his generation might reasonably do. The working land and everything attached to it to the eldest son, and a separate parcel to the daughter. That the separate parcel happened to be 42 acres of exposed hilltop that had produced nothing in living memory was presented in the solicitor's careful prose as a straightforward inheritance rather than a diminishment. Martin glanced at her for the first time when the page was turned. His expression was composed, the look of a man who has settled something in his own mind and sees no reason to reopen it. He said nothing until they stood on the step outside in the pale March light. "You can sell the hill if you find a buyer," he said. "I doubt you will. There's nothing up there but stone and weather." He was not unkind in his manner. He said it the way a person might relay an unfortunate fact about the harvest. "If you need the house for the winter, you're welcome to stay until spring. After that, I intend to bring in a housekeeper." Eleanor thanked him. She kept her voice level without effort, because she was not thinking about Martin. She was thinking about one word in her father's faded brown ink, registered. She left the following morning. She did not stay until spring. She had £7 and 4 shillings, money accumulated over several years from the quarterly household allowance her father had given her, supplemented by 2 modest payments for clerical work she had carried out for Mr. Hale's office during the boundary dispute of 1853. She had her clothes, her books, a wooden traveling case worn smooth at the corners, and the ledger in which she had kept her own private accounts since the age of 19. In her coat pocket, a hand-drawn map and a question she intended to answer. She hired a cart to take her to Cairn Hill on a Tuesday in late March. The driver, a man named Colby, who had hauled goods along the hill road for 30 years, knew the northern slope by reputation. He offered the information unprompted. Nobody had worked that land since before his time. "Your father had some notion about it once," he said. "Came up here with a surveyor fellow, back in 41 or 42. Before the railways came through the valley, nothing came of it, far as anyone knew. The cart track ended 3/4 of a mile below the summit. Eleanor walked the rest with her case. The slope was steep and uneven, the ground still hard from winter, the bracken not yet come in for the year. The hillside was open and honest, brown and gray, the rocks pushing through the thin soil in long, irregular ridges that ran roughly north to south, like the spines of something old and patient beneath the surface. The hut came into view when she reached the crest. It was worse than she had expected. One main roof timber had snapped under the winter's snow, and half the slate had come down with it. The walls were sound, old stone, thick and competently laid, but the door was gone entirely, carried off for firewood at some point in the recent past. Inside, a stone floor, a shallow hearth caked with soot, the remains of a collapsed wooden shelf, and a great quantity of dead leaves banked against the north wall. Eleanor set her case against the soundest wall and stood in the empty doorframe and looked north. The slope dropped away steeply, then leveled briefly perhaps 150 feet below, before dropping again toward the valley. And there, on that leveled shelf, the color of the ground changed. It was not a gradual shift in the way soils often varied across a hillside. This was sharp. The pale limestone and sandy soil of the upper slope gave way along a distinct horizontal line to something darker, blue-gray rock that held the flat light differently from the stone above it, as though it were denser, more deliberate. She took the map from her pocket and unfolded it in the doorway. She found the crosshatched section without difficulty. It corresponded precisely to what she was looking at. The same shape, the same position, the same approximate dimensions. Her father had marked it with the care he brought to everything he considered important. She folded the map and put it away. That evening, she made a fire in the hearth with bracken wood, spread her coat over her case for a pillow, and slept tolerably well for a woman who had just inherited a ruin on a hill in March with £7 to her name. In the morning, she went down to the village. Ascombe sat at the base of Cairn Hill, a public house, a chapel, a post office, a blacksmith's yard, and a row of stone cottages whose gardens were just beginning to show the first pale green of the year. Eleanor recognized the mason's yard from childhood visits. The sign above the gate read, "Aldred and Son," the same family whose boundary question she had helped resolve a decade earlier. She knocked and waited. William Aldred was in his 60s, a stocky man with a close white beard and the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to working with materials that did not respond to haste. He expressed condolences for Thomas in a brief and genuine way, and then waited, without impatience, to hear what she had come about. Eleanor told him what she had seen: the change in rock color on the north face, the sharp boundary line, the cross-hatching on the map. She showed him the map, the shape of the cross-hatched section, without the inscription, and asked if he knew what kind of stone it was. Aldred looked at the map. Then he looked at her. "Gritstone seam," he said, "runs under the north face and breaks the surface along that shelf, maybe 40 yards across, possibly more. Good building stone, hard-wearing, easy to split cleanly. There were plans to work it at some point. Something stopped it. A legal matter, I heard, though I was young then and didn't pay it close attention." He handed back the map. "Your father knew more about it than I did." Eleanor took the market coach to Northallerton that afternoon and spent 2 hours in the records room of the land registry. She found the entry for Cairn Hill without great difficulty. The registration was dated September 1841. Thomas Voss, registered claimant, quarry working rights, gritstone extraction, north face, Cairn Hill. Below it, in a different hand, status suspended, November 1841. Production not commenced within statutory period. There was nothing after that. Eleanor copied every detail into her own ledger. The registration number, the date, the statutory reference, the surveyor's name, the precise wording of the suspension notice. She wrote in the small, even hand her father had taught her, leaving nothing out and adding nothing that was not there. Then she asked the clerk whether a suspended registration of this kind could be reinstated. He said he was not certain, and suggested she speak to a solicitor. It was Mrs. Holt who told her about the railway company, 4 days after Eleanor's return from Northallerton. Mrs. Holt was a widow in the End cottage who had taken to bringing Eleanor a pot of soup in the evenings, partly from neighborly instinct, partly from curiosity. She mentioned that men from a company in Leeds had been seen in Ascombe the previous week, speaking to the blacksmith about stone. The new railway line coming through the valley would require substantial quantities of it, and they were looking for local sources. Eleanor set down her cup very carefully. She returned to Northallerton the following week and sought out a solicitor. Mr. Frederick Lorne's name appeared in the county directory at the post office. His waiting room smelled pleasantly of coal and old paper, and she sat there for 20 minutes beside a man in muddy boots who appeared to be disputing a fence line before being shown in. Mr. Lorne was a compact, gray-haired man who listened without interrupting and, when she had finished, asked exactly 3 questions. First, did she have the original registration document? She did not. It would be among her father's papers at the farm. Second, did she have evidence of continuous ownership? She had the map, her copy of the registry entry, and her father's verbal instruction. Third, had any other party registered a claim on the parcel since 1841? Not that she had found. Mr. Lorne said that a suspended registration was not the same as a forfeited one. The statutory period for commencing production had passed in 1841, which was why the registration had been marked suspended. But the underlying title had never been surrendered. If Eleanor could produce the original registration document and show that the parcel had remained in Voss family ownership without interruption, there were grounds for a reinstatement application. It would require time, it would cost money, and it might be contested. She asked, by whom? Anyone who believes they hold a competing interest, he said, or anyone who has recently become aware that the land may be worth something. She paid his consultation fee and walked back to the coaching inn. On the road to Ascombe, she began to think, with some care, about Martin. She did not have long to wait. Within the week, a letter arrived at the village post office. It was from Mr. Gareth Hale, Martin's solicitor. It informed her that Martin Voss had reason to believe the northern parcel had been incorrectly separated from the main farm title, and that certain working rights properly belonged to the estate as a whole. Mr. Hale respectfully requested that Eleanor take no further action regarding the land pending formal review. Eleanor read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in her ledger. She needed 2 things: the original registration document and time. The document was at the farm, almost certainly in the tin chest her father had kept on the lower shelf of the study. Martin had not yet cleared the study. She confirmed this through Mrs. Holt's daughter, who still had acquaintance with the farm's kitchen staff. The chest had a clasp lock, and she knew from long familiarity that a duplicate key had hung in the kitchen beside the back door ever since the original was briefly mislaid one winter. Her father had never removed it. She went to the farm on a Thursday, when she knew Martin would be at market. Mrs. Brandt, the cook, had known Eleanor since she was 7, and let her in without hesitation. Eleanor went to the study, found the chest on its shelf, opened it with the kitchen key, and located the registration document in the second layer of papers inside a card envelope marked 1841. Behind it was the original survey report, a formal document produced by a licensed land surveyor in August of that year, setting out the extent of the gritstone seam, the quality of the stone, and the precise boundaries of the proposed working area. She took both documents. She replaced the remaining papers as she had found them, locked the chest, returned the key to the nail by the kitchen door, thanked Mrs. Brandt, and was back on the road to Ascombe before midday. When she laid both documents before Mr. Lorne later that week, he examined them in silence before he spoke. The registration was properly executed. The survey was thorough and signed by a licensed professional. The suspension of November 1841 was administrative, a notation made when production had not commenced within the required period, not a forfeiture of the title itself. The working rights remained attached to the land and had passed through the will to Eleanor. His fee for the reinstatement application would be £4 and 10 shillings. Eleanor had £3 and 2 shillings. She went to William Aldred the following morning. She did not ask for charity. She set out the situation plainly: the registration, the application, the railway company's known interest in local stone, and offered a formal written agreement. 5% of the first extraction season's revenue, witnessed and signed. Aldred asked several practical questions about the document and the stone. Then he went inside and came back with the money in a cloth purse. "Your father was a straight man," he said, "and the stone on that hillside is worth having, if the registration holds." Eleanor wrote the agreement at his table, in her clearest hand. He signed it without amendment. She posted the solicitor's fee by the morning coach. Mr. Hale submitted his formal objection to the reinstatement application within 3 weeks of its filing. The objection argued that the quarry working rights had been intended as part of the main farm estate and that their administrative separation in 1841 had never been ratified by any binding instrument independent of the registration itself. It was a capable argument. Mr. Lorne acknowledged this with professional detachment and said he was not troubled by it. Eleanor noted his equanimity and chose not to rely on it entirely. The review was set before the county land registrar in North Allerton, a procedural hearing, not a court proceeding, but binding in its result. Eleanor spent the intervening weeks in the hut on Cairn Hill, which she had made livable in a manner that was spare but no longer miserable. A piece of oilcloth closed the gap in the roof. A second-hand door from the blacksmith's yard blocked the wind from the north. Mrs. Holt's iron stove, offered from her back room with the pragmatic generosity of a woman who recognized necessity when she saw it, heated the interior adequately. Eleanor worked on the documents each evening by lamplight. She wrote out a clean, sequential account of the ownership chain, her grandfather's land, her father's separation of the northern parcel in 1841, the registration, the survey, the suspension, the will, her own inheritance. She set it out the way she had always set out a difficult ledger, in plain order, each point supported by the one before it. Nothing asserted that the papers did not confirm. She cross-referenced every document against the points in Mr. Hale's objection. She also wrote to the Yorkshire Railway Construction Company. She found their address in a commercial directory at the North Allerton Post Office. Her letter was brief and businesslike. She was the registered holder of quarry working rights on the north face of Cairn Hill and expected formal confirmation of those rights within the month. She asked whether the company would be willing to discuss a supply arrangement pending confirmation. A reply arrived 11 days later. The company's procurement agent, a Mr. Samuel Reeve, would be in the area the following month and would be pleased to meet with her. In the mornings, before the light was strong enough for close writing, she walked the north face with a length of cord knotted at regular intervals, tracing the visible extent of the gritstone exposure and recording the figures in her ledger. The seam ran, she calculated, approximately 48 yards along the shelf. She wrote the figures and marked the column clearly. Estimate. Provisional. She did not present estimates as facts, but she wanted to understand, as precisely as she could, exactly what she was going to the hearing to protect. On the morning of the hearing, she rose early and walked the north face one last time in the gray half-light before the coach came. The gritstone held the early light differently from the limestone above it, steady and quiet, not immediately obvious to anyone who had not been taught to look. Her father had looked. He had measured it, registered it, and left it for her with nothing more than a map and 4 words, trusting her to find the rest. She stood there for a moment in the stillness before the valley woke, then picked up her case and went down to the road. The registrar's room in North Allerton was plain: a long table, wooden chairs, a window overlooking a cobbled yard. Mr. Lorne sat beside Eleanor on one side, his documents arranged neatly. Mr. Hale sat opposite with Martin, who had come in person. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the surface of the wood, and she did not readily determine what that signified. The registrar was a small, dry man named Croft, who conducted proceedings with the economy of someone who had presided over a great many such hearings. He asked Mr. Hale to present the objection first. Mr. Hale was thorough. The northern parcel had been administratively separated from the main farm title in 1841, he acknowledged. But this had been an internal arrangement made by Thomas Voss in contemplation of a venture that had not proceeded. The suspension of the registration demonstrated that the venture had been abandoned. The parcel had thereafter been managed as part of the broader farm operation, and the will, which had not specifically addressed quarry working rights, could not be read as transferring those rights to a separate legatee without explicit language to that effect. Mr. Lorne was concise in response. The registration of 1841 was properly executed and had never been revoked. The suspension was an administrative notation. It recorded that production had not commenced, nothing more, and it had not transferred the title or extinguished the registered interest. The parcel had been named in the will as Eleanor's specific inheritance and had been probated without objection. No competing registration had been filed at any point in 17 years. The working rights had passed with the land under the will. He placed the original registration document before the registrar. Mr. Croft examined it at length. He read the suspension notice. He looked at the surveyor's reference and the date. He set the document down and asked Mr. Hale one question. Did his client have any documentary evidence that the quarry working rights had ever been incorporated into the main farm title under any formal instrument? Mr. Hale said the argument rested on the practical management of the parcel as part of the broader estate, and on implied intention. The registrar wrote something on his papers and did not ask another question. The hearing lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes. Mr. Croft closed his file, thanked both solicitors, and said his written decision would be delivered within the week. Eleanor did not speak during the hearing. There had been no occasion for her to do so. She sat with her hands in her lap and her closed ledger on the table beside her, not as a prop, but as a habit, the thing she brought when figures mattered, and she listened carefully to every word. Martin had not looked at her once. As they filed out afterward, he paused briefly on the step and appeared about to say something. She did not invite it. She went to the coaching inn, had a cup of tea, and waited for the return coach. The registrar's written decision arrived at Mr. Lorne's office 7 days later. Eleanor received the copy by post the following morning. The reinstatement application was approved. Eleanor Voss was confirmed as the registered holder of quarry working rights on the north face of Cairn Hill. The objection was dismissed on the grounds that no documentary evidence had been produced to demonstrate that the registration had been revoked or that the working rights had passed to any other party by any instrument prior to the will. Eleanor read it twice at the table in the hut, with the stove ticking and the morning lamp still burning. She folded it precisely and placed it in her ledger between the copy of the original registration and the page on which she had set out the ownership chain. Then she put on her coat and walked down to the village to tell William Aldred. He was in the yard when she arrived, splitting a length of stone with the unhurried precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. She handed him the decision without preamble. He read it, handed it back, and said, "Right then." It was exactly sufficient. Mr. Samuel Reeve, of the Yorkshire Railway Construction Company, arrived in Ascombe on a Friday afternoon in late July. Eleanor met him in the back room of the public house, which she had engaged for the purpose. She had walked the north face that morning and reviewed her figures. She had spoken again with Aldred, who had given her the current market rate for good Yorkshire gritstone per cartload, stated plainly and without commentary. Reeve was a brisk man in his 40s who made no particular adjustment in his manner for the fact that his present supplier was a woman. Eleanor found this, on balance, useful. He examined the registration certificate and the survey report, asked about access and estimated yield, and named a price per cartload that was 18% below the figure Aldred had given her. Eleanor named a figure 4% above it. They negotiated for 20 minutes with the level efficiency of two people who understood what the stone was worth. They settled at the market rate. Reeve proposed a 12-month contract. Eleanor proposed 6 months with a review clause. Reeve accepted. She had the contract signed by both parties before he left the village that evening. She hired 2 men from Ascombe in August. Aldred supervised the first weeks of clearing work on the approach track without additional charge, which Eleanor recorded in her ledger under a heading she marked simply, Debt, Non-Monetary. The stone-cutting equipment arrived on hire from a supplier in Harrogate at the end of August, unloaded at the foot of the hill track with considerably more disruption than Ascombe had witnessed in some years. The shepherd's hut was repaired properly that autumn. A new roof with sound slating, the walls repointed with good mortar. A level floor laid over the old stone. Eleanor converted the interior into a working office, a desk at the north window where the light came in clean from the north face below, and shelves for the growing correspondence and contracts that now arrived with a regularity she found quietly satisfying. On the wall above the desk, pinned between 2 small shelves, she hung her father's map, the cross-hatching over the north slope, the faded brown ink, the 4 words she had carried in her coat pocket on the morning her brother took everything, North Slope, do not sell. Mrs. Holt's evening soup pot had become, by October, something more properly described as friendship. It suited them both considerably better than charity would have done. William Aldred received his 5% at the end of the first extraction season, in November of 1859. He took it the same way he had given the loan, without ceremony, which was his manner of indicating the matter had been handled correctly, and there was nothing further to say. By the close of that first full season, Eleanor had paid back Aldred's loan in full, settled Mr. Lorne's fees without remainder, paid the 2 quarrymen their wages for the year, met the equipment hire costs, and had £11 remaining in her ledger. £11 was not a fortune, but it was real money, derived from real work, from 42 acres of rock and bracken that her brother had described on a solicitor's step as nothing but stone and weather. The ledger balanced. The column totals were correct. There was nothing missing and nothing inflated. She heard through the ordinary channels of village life that the farm had endured a difficult year, a wet spring, a failed barley crop, an expensive drainage repair that had not been budgeted for. She did not seek this information out. It arrived the way that information always arrived in small places, with no particular intention attached to it. She did not feel triumph when she heard it. She felt, more precisely, the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that resolves correctly after a long column of complicated figures. Everything accounted for, nothing owing, the page turned cleanly. She did not need Martin to acknowledge what had happened. She found she had not needed it for some time. The hill was hers. The quarry was registered. The contracts were signed. The stone moved down the track on Thursday mornings and returned nothing but clean figures to her ledger. And on the wall of the repaired shepherd's hut, in the office where she worked each morning by the north window, her father's map hung not as a relic, but as a working document, the first and most important survey she had ever been asked to read. North Slope, do not sell. She had not sold it. She had read it. And that, in the end, was what her father had always known she would do, because he had watched her do it all her life, at the kitchen table with the candle between them and the ledger open, patient and precise and unwilling to leave a figure unaccounted for. The map had been his last entry in that particular ledger. She had carried the balance forward herself. The ledger was settled, the fire was burning, and the stone of Cairn Hill was doing exactly what Thomas Voss had believed it would do on the day he first walked the north face with a surveyor and a plan, if only someone read the map. There is something in Eleanor's story that I find myself returning to long after the telling is done. She did not shout, she did not demand satisfaction, she did not require her brother to apologize, or the registrar to praise her, or the railwaymen to remark on what she had quietly built. She simply read what was in front of her, kept what she was given, and worked steadily with what she had. The hill that was meant to diminish her became the thing that freed her, not by luck, not by rescue, but because she paid attention to a faded note in an old man's handwriting, and she trusted what it said. If that kind of story is one you find yourself returning to in the evenings, I would very much welcome you among the listeners here. There is a subscribe button nearby, and pressing it costs nothing and means that the next story will find its way to you without any searching required. And if you are inclined to leave a comment, I would be glad to know. If you had been in Eleanor's position on that morning in the solicitor's office, with the repaired mourning dress and the 3 copper coins and the folded map in your coat pocket, what would you have done first? Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next story.